Hello everyone. In this video, I'll highlight a few of the main ideas from chapters 4 and chapters 10. I'm combining my coverage of these two chapters together because this is how I cover these topics when I teach this course face-to-face. For me, they go together. So I like to think of culture as an iceberg. With an iceberg, you see only a little bit of it above the surface. The bulk of it is underneath the surface. So this part that we can see is the surface structure. So the surface structure of a culture is food, dress, artifacts like art and music and media. These are the kind of things that you could see and experience if you go to a foreign culture as a visitor. The stuff that's beneath the surface that isn't to see by outsiders, we call the deep structure of a culture. These are influenced by social institutions like family, religion, state or national community affiliation. These things will probably not be recognized to outsiders or as obvious to how people live their lives on a daily basis unless you actually live in a foreign culture for a while. And just as what's beneath the surface of the iceberg is the bulk of the iceberg, the deep structure of a culture is the bulk of what drives its behavior. The deep structure is substantial. So as you can see here, in this introduction of culture, we are already considering the role of family and the influence of other types of organizations and institutions, such as religion and national affiliation. This is why I chose to cover these topics together, although they are in different or non-adjacent chapters in your textbook. The deep structure of culture is our conscious and unconscious assumptions about how the world works. These assumptions are deeply felt, and they carry that culture's most important messages. So as an example, and one that we see almost on a daily basis, is one of the most deeply felt assumptions. Our worldview in the United States is the concept of freedom. We carry that close to our hearts, and it is fiercely defended. The deep structure of a culture is resistant to change. Think of culture like an ocean liner. If it wants to change direction, it takes quite a bit of energy and time to get it to change direction. So, while popular culture may be open to change, at least in the United States and many European countries, the core values and beliefs and ethics and morals and religious practices and the role of government and so on do persist from generation to generation due to the deep structure of culture. So why should we care about cultural differences? This is a communication class on conflict management. On a macro or world level, we are not isolated in the world. It's important that we can manage conflict with people from other countries and cultures. And on a micro level, we don't live in a bubble where everyone is the same either. Even within the US, there are many co-cultures or diverse communities within our larger culture. We can't paint every US citizen with the same brush. So it benefits us all if we can learn to communicate well and manage conflict well with people from communities that are very different from our own. The values that people hold in a culture can be thought of as points along a continuum. Why? Because there is duplication and similarities in values among cultures. For example, while we have our differences, our culture in the US is similar in many ways to many other cultures. What you see here on the screen are some vocabulary words for us to learn, not the hola and bonjour and all of that, but what's above it. They are going to appear again on a couple of different extra credit activities that I have planned for you. So let's start with the values on that bottom continuum first, which is the easiest to comprehend. Individualism and collectivism refer to whether the needs of the individual are more highly valued in a culture or if the needs of the group outweigh the needs of a single person. If you are familiar with Star Trek, or if there are any Trekkies among you, or is it Trekkers? I forget. This little image here is from the film Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, one of the more well-known of the Star Trek films of the original Star Trek, in which Spock there, as you see, is dying. He's contaminated by radiation, I believe, and he says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few because his friend there, Captain Kirk, is upset that his friend is dying because he kind of threw himself on the gauntlet, so to speak. Spock sacrificed himself to save the whole ship. So that is an example of a collectivistic or a collectivistic point of view, collectivistic value, or what we call collectivism. High context and low context communication are also on a continuum here. This is how verbal we are in our communication with others. Communication can be nonverbal. And in some cultures where tradition is highly valued, certain things are assumed or expected of people's behavior rather than explicitly articulated. The US is typically low context, meaning we speak a lot and spell things out. Our rules and customs are frequently written down, often as official laws, and if they aren't law, someone will tell us that we aren't following the norms of the society. But in a high context culture, by contrast, it is assumed that cultural members know how to behave in certain situations. Less is spoken, more is nonverbal, and the culture as a whole is much more traditional. By that I mean their customs are time-honored. So you can imagine that as a visitor in a high context culture, if you are more low context, the difference in expectations about one another's behavior can potentially cause problems in your communication. So here is a graphic that I pulled in from another textbook, which I find very interesting. This author has combined the values of individualism and low context together. Be aware they are not the same thing, but they do often occur together. Likewise, she's combined high context communication with what she's calling relational. That is essentially what I just called a moment ago collectivistic or collectivism. So it is true, you do tend to find these things together, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. So let's take a look at some of the differences, though, in this illustration. One of the things that immediately strikes me is the eye contact. You see the difference there. The one on the left has a more focused eye contact, and really it should be looking at the other person because that is our value in the lower context cultures. We like to make eye contact and we find it offensive if people don't look us in the eye, right? Okay, so by contrast, the more high context cultures consider it rude to maintain eye contact or to stare at the other person. It is considered aggressive. It's actually rather more respectful to humbly avert your gaze. Whereas, once again, in the low context cultures, we find it disrespectful if someone doesn't look at us. We find it even dishonest if another person is talking to us and they won't look us in the eye, right? So you can see, once again, if people from different kinds of cultures are trying to communicate, lots of things can happen. People can really misinterpret the signals from each other, right? Okay, so another thing I find interesting in this illustration is that the way you say things, look on the right side of the graphic, the way you say things in a high context culture matters more than, look on the left side now, the actual words that you say matter more in a low context culture. So in a low context culture like the United States, what you say is what you mean. Okay. And the very last thing I want to point out is in a high context culture, rather, sorry, so look on the right side of the screen again, the history or the relationship between the two people is very important. It defines how you speak to certain people. So here is an example of that. It's a personal example of mine. I kind of stepped in it when I was in England. So they are low context like we are in the US, but they are not as low context as we are. So most of the people I encountered in my first year there were very reserved around me, and I found it hard to figure out what they really thought. It turns out that many of the things I was doing that were counter to their cultural norms were coming across strong. Being overtly or overly friendly and a little too outwardly bubbly or happy and expressive for the standard British stiff upper lip. They must have thought that I was so annoying. I think I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in a very big way. And this in turn caused problems and conflicts for me that entire first year because no one would tell me not to be the way I was being or why I was getting the reaction I was. I could just tell they did not like me and I didn't know why. I don't think they could articulate it either, though, actually. And again, the reason for that is that a lot of these deeply felt assumptions about how people should behave and interact comes from the influence, sort of an unconscious influence of the deep structure of a culture. So here's the caveat. Even within a culture, we as individuals might have different values. For example, if the US is considered the world's most individualistic culture, but you individually might be a more collectivistic person, then how do you label yourself? So in the extra credit activities that I'm going to offer to you, I hope you'll have fun with them. You can take a survey to figure out how individualistic you are versus collectivistic. I also have another survey about various other value orientations, like some of the ones that we have just discussed. There's also going to be an essay reflection extra credit where you can reflect on the outcomes that you get from those two surveys. So remember that these are points on a continuum. It's not an either or polar black and white situation. And depending upon who is doing the research, the results of where countries and cultures fall on these continuums is not precise. So here's what our textbook says about where the most individualistic and collectivistic cultures are located in the world. Take a look at these two lists. We've got the most individualist on the left and the most collectivist on the right. Look at those first four of the top 5. Do you see any connection between them? I would say Great Britain colonizing might be part of it. I realize Canada is partly colonized by France as well. Okay, now take a look at the most collectivist cultures. Do you see something interesting on that side? Any things that tie all of those together? Those are largely Latin cultures, or those that were colonized by Spain. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So here is a graph I pulled off the web. I should have cited the source. I did this so long ago that I don't know where I found this now. Anyway, so here's a graph that someone put together as far as where they believe the different countries fall on the continuum between high context and low context communication. Okay, so take a look there. On the left-hand side is the lower context communication cultures, the Swiss being at the farthest left, German next, Scandinavian next, and then there's us, American, then you got Australian. They don't list, okay, so I'm assuming that UK is going to fall to them in the other Northern European probably, so right there in the middle, which again, remember my example about the low context, high context problem I encountered when I was there. So this might partially explain that. We're a little bit apart on this continuum here, but keep going down the line. You got South American, African, South European, and then you've got Arab and Asian cultures. Asian at the far right of the being higher context, so using more nonverbals, more customary traditions for the behavior and so on. So remember what I said a moment ago, that these actually can vary depending upon who's doing the research. Here is another version that I found. This one is slightly different when you look at where things are. And once again, you still have one of the Asian cultures over there on the far high context on the right, Chinese, yes. And you still got African and Arab are still relatively toward that end as well. Then on the other side, they consider Germany. I don't see Switzerland though, so who knows? But and then Scandinavian, and then American. So roughly similar progression. And then English, so that would be the British, where I was when I was having that problem. And then the French, Italian, Spanish. I think this one's interesting because in the previous chart, if I were to flip back to that, my recording will stop, so I'll just stay here. In the previous one, those southern European countries, France, Italy, Spain, well, there's Greece. Greece is about in the same spot. So some of those were actually further, I think, to the right side of this continuum, depending, I guess. France is maybe, I don't know, you're kind of in the middle there, France. So, but Italian, Spanish, I think they're considered more southern. They're more warmer. Yes. Anyway, so you can see that there are differences. People have different opinions, and a lot of this is coming from actual research that they've done. So here's another value called face. Face is essentially a person's dignity or reputation. So if we have more concern about maintaining our own dignity and reputation, that's considered self-face. And a culture where this is predominant has a lower face concern. By contrast, in high face concern cultures, maintaining other people's dignity takes precedence. This is called mutual or other face. So while that is a really generous ideal to adhere to be respectful of others' reputations to that extent, often in such cultures, conflicts and disagreements are considered threatening. And this can result in the condition I covered with you a couple weeks ago, groupthink, where innovation doesn't happen, and sometimes even bad ideas are adopted because no one wants to offend anyone else in the group. So again, cultures fall on a continuum between having all of these values, low face and high face included. It's not an either or situation. So let's explore family values in the US versus 3 other groupings of cultures that each comprise multiple countries in the world. First, let's consider how each culture handles aging. And as I get older, this chart makes me want to move. I'm kidding. But this is interesting. Okay, so even in the UK, which I don't list here, I learned something surprising when I lived there. In the UK, no elderly person is left behind or homeless or uncared for unless it is by their own choice. And I did not know, I did actually know of one individual when I lived there who was an old elderly man who was homeless. He lived in the city center of Sunderland and walked around all day with a suitcase. I never spoke to him. I should have. I always wanted to know. It's like, hey, you can have a free house. Why are you doing this? I couldn't understand it. But in the UK will house and feed and care for every elderly person, whether or not they can care for themselves. So if they can't care for themselves, then that care is going to happen in a nursing home, which, those aren't ideal for anyone anywhere in the world, but it's better than being completely neglected. And in the UK, it's 100% free. So even that elderly person's relatives don't have to have money to pay for that. If the elderly person can care for themselves, they're still offered free housing. In fact, anyone is if they are unemployed. It's a much different system than in the US, but it does have a cost, I'm sure you've heard. And whether you think their system is superior or our system is superior, it's a matter of political preference. Their taxes are quite high there. They're not impossibly high. You can still, do okay. It's just high compared to most places in the United States. So let's take a closer view of this chart. And if anybody doubts that the US prefers youth to age, look at Hollywood and Botox and etc. Okay. All right. So there are a couple of exceptions. A couple of our co-cultures are exceptions. The Native American elders are very important to those tribes. And then in the African American community, grandmothers are very important and considered the central role in the family. So if we take a look at the rest of the cultures here, there's all sorts of reverence for elders that we don't have in the US. And I am envious. But again, I'm not that old, right? Anyway, so it's just nice. I just like it. I like to see that they respect their elderly to the extent that they do. How we got this way in the US, I don't know, but it would be an interesting thing to research, don't you think? Okay, next let's consider the differences in family values with respect to gender. I've added a new culture for this one. Can you see it? I did that because when it comes to gender roles, India differs from many of the other countries on the Asian continent. So, there, males are still considered superior, as in most cultures here that you see, and women are expected to support the husband's concerns. But the fact that femininity and masculinity are considered oppositional, I find interesting. And that is due to the influence of Hinduism in that country. There are other faiths there, other religions there, and there's a conflation of them actually, which makes India a particularly interesting case to study in this respect. Okay, on the rest of these, do you see any patterns? You may have to expand your screen if you're watching it in that tiny window of the page that I have posted this on in Canvas. For the most part, women don't have as much reverence anywhere except the US. But even in the US, if you take a look at that column there, women are socialized to be, and this is still occurring, I know that we're trying to be forward thinking, but it still happens. Women are socialized to be nurturing and sensitive and to be concerned about the way they look. So think about this, if you doubt that at all, when a woman comes across as being more aggressive, self-reliant, or independent, and unattractive on top of it all, whereas we don't hold men to the same standard, our culture is not always kind to them. Perhaps you can think of examples of this in popular culture. I can think of loads, or even politics. A man versus a woman in power gets a much different response in the United States, usually. Okay, one of the things I do find remarkable about one of these cultures here is the Latinx cultures and what it says there about how they revere and honor motherhood. Okay, so on this one, I mentioned I would come back to the Latinx cultures earlier. I can't say for sure the exact reason. I'm not all-knowing, I'm not omniscient, but as I understand it, historically, tribal cultures going back to the pre-modern times, and I mean by pre-modern, I mean thousands of years ago, women were revered in many of the ancient tribal cultures because of their seemingly magical ability to give and sustain life. It is notable then, considering the history of Latinx cultures, which developed following Spain's colonialism of the native tribes that were already inhabiting those lands. So, who knows, maybe some of those ancient cultural values survived. I hope you found all of that very interesting, fascinating, in fact. Hopefully all of this gives you some food for thought when it comes to studying communication and conflict management. I love exploring cultural dynamics and considering the ways that it impacts our communication with each other. So that's it for chapters 4 and 10. If you have any questions, you know where to post them. Thank you for watching, and I will be in touch with you again very soon.